Grazie. Allora, prima in inglese, poi in italiano. Good evening and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the fifth appointment in this cycle of international video conferences. This is the fifth appointment in 2022 on the Zoom platform. As you know, all these video conferences are dedicated to tramways and other means of transport. Tonight's presentation will deal with Glasgow's tramways and will be held by Hugh McAulay, the president of the Scottish Tramway and Transport Society. The presentation will be done in English, and as usual, at the end of the evening, there will be a space for any questions in English or in Italian, and you can also use the chat in English or in Italian in every moment during the presentation. I remind you that complete program of the forthcoming presentation is available, as always, on our internet site. Thank you. And now I say some words in Italian. Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti al quinto appuntamento nel 2022 di questo ciclo internazionale di videoconferenze sulla piattaforma Zoom, dedicata ai tram e agli altri mezzi di trasporto. Prima che inizi la presentazione, vi dico che questa sera abbiamo una presentazione fatta dal presidente della Scottish Tramway Transport Society, Hugh McAulay, che riguarderà i tram di Glasgow, che sono notoriamente stati la rete più importante della Gran Bretagna dopo Londra, quindi una grande rete tranviaria. La presentazione sarà fatta in inglese. Alla fine della serata ci sarà spazio per domande in inglese o in italiano, ma potete anche usare la chat in ogni momento durante la presentazione. Vi ricordo che il programma completo delle prossime videoconferenze è sempre disponibile sul nostro sito internet. Ed ora la parola va a Hugh. Thank you. The floor goes now to Hugh. Please, Hugh, you can share the screen and begin.
Thank you, Roberto. Can I be heard okay? Hello?
Yeah, okay, fine.
Absolutely fine.
Is the volume loud enough to be heard?
Easily.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much. Right, greetings everybody from Glasgow in Scotland. Glasgow is the largest city at the moment in Scotland, but it's about to be overtaken by Edinburgh. It had trams for 90 years, 1872 to 1962. Horse for 30, and electric trams for 64 years. The Pinxton Power Station supplied the electricity for the tramways for up to 1958, and when the end of the tramways was in sight, the power station was sold off. Right, in 1872, Glasgow was expanding rapidly. It was 498,000 people. Shipyards, locomotive works, heavy industry, a steady flow of people from the Highlands and the islands of Scotland and immigrants from Ireland. It was to become the second city of the British Empire, with a population of 1.2 million by the outbreak of World War II. In the 20th century, it expanded rapidly by absorbing surrounding boroughs. And I haven't spelt boroughs wrong. That's the way the Scots spell the English word borough. The shipyard boroughs of Partick and Govan were particularly large. Govan was over 100,000 when it was absorbed. Further expansion went on, which brought the population up to what I mentioned before. The trams expanded well beyond the city limits and served 9 independent boroughs and 13 other towns in their lifetime. Right, the first image is one of the early horse trams. It's taken in what was called the Trongate an east-west thoroughfare through the city centre. The first route opened in 1872 was 2.5 miles long, roughly 4 kilometres. It went from the west end of the city southward through the centre, across the River Clyde for about a mile. The track gauge was 4'7 3/4, and that was to enable standard gauge railway wagons to run on the tram lines on their flanges. That was to be used in one very special instance by a shipyard, and there's evidence of that later. The tracks were owned by the corporation but leased to the Glasgow Tramway and Omnibus Company. In the middle 1890s, the Caledonian Railway Company built an underground railway right through the heart of the city under Argyle Street, the main east-west thoroughfare. And it created a lot of upheaval for the tram tracks. When the tracks were put back, the city council laid conduit cable sheaves because they were considering using cable when they took the horse trams over. The lease of the horse trams expired in 1894, but by that time, the company and the city council were literally at war with each other, and the council would not renew the lease. So when the lease was up, the company made it plain they wouldn't sell the vehicles to the council. So the city council had about 2 years in which to buy land, build depots, get horse cars, get horses, all etc. All for the 1st of July 1894. That's the latter days of the company tram system, when the cars were looking not terribly well kept. On the opening day of the corporation horse trams, they had managed to assemble about 48% of the cars they needed. The Tramway and Omnibus Company flooded the streets with brand new horse buses, but it didn't work. The corporation horse trams took the business, and the horse buses simply withered away. This is looking along Argyle Street, the east-west main shopping centre at that time. The tram on the right is turning into Jamaica Street, and that curve was to prove the nemesis of some bogie cars in the 1920s. It's a very sharp curve, and it caused a lot of grief later. That was the livery of the corporation horse cars, that shade of brown. The route colours were shown along the side of the top deck. Routes they had used white, yellow, green, red, blue, chocolate, brown, and believe it or not, tartan. But when the corporation took them over, they didn't bother with chocolate, brown, and tartan. But the use of route colours to distinguish the routes was to survive right until the 1950s, even when there was a numbering scheme in operation. The city council immediately set about building a huge car works, Copler Hill Car Works, on the south side of the city, about a mile from the city centre. Had a railway on the west side and a railway going diagonally across the picture also, and also had a rail connection. Glasgow was to build all its trams, bar 80, which I'll come to, over the years. The last new tram being built in 1954. The first electric route was opened on the where are we? In 1898, using single deckers, which was an odd choice for a city with a densely packed population into 3-storey tenements. The reason being the first route they chose had a very low railway bridge, and they were forced to buy these single deckers. A group of councillors and bailies had had a trip across to America and were very impressed with what they saw, and this was the result. The rear of the car, the windows were not glazed. There were translucent blinds. You can just see them at the top of the Tudor arch. They were not successful. The accident rate was high with a central entrance. The bogies were a disaster. They were so bad that they kept climbing out of corners and points, and at various points on the route, there had to be groups of men permanently stationed to get them back in the tracks. There were 21 built, and there was never any more single deckers built. That's one in operation. I think it might have been an official trip at the opening or before it, because there's an awful lot of top hats in the front of the tram. And the first route ran through a very working class area and industrial area. And there wouldn't have been that many top hats around in that district. This is one of the cars which actually survived. The cars were all out of service by 1906 and got rid of, but one was converted into a permanent way car and given 4 motors. And the giving of 4 motors cured the problem of climbing out of tracks. It lasted till 1951, when the then infant Scottish Tramway Museum Society, the predecessor of Scottish Tramway and Transport Society, managed to acquire this. That was the first car they ever sort of acquired. And it was ultimately restored in Copeland Hill Car Works. It's just turning out of it. And it's now in the Glasgow Museum of Transport in the city centre. This was the first of what they called standard cars. They were to build between 1898 and 1904, 535 of them. There was an exhibition in Glasgow in 1901, an international exhibition, and between 1898 and 1901, the transport department absolutely bust a gut, electrifying 2 routes to the international exhibition in Kelvingrove Park in the West End. And they had it up and running for the opening of the exhibition. The horse car system was completely converted by 1902, just less than a 4-year period in actual fact. They were so keen to get new cars on the road, they bought 80 bodies from what was then called the Gloucester Carriage and Wagon Company, and they fitted them completely in Copeland Hill Car Works. To the end of the system, the men in the car works spoke derisively of what they termed the Gloucesters. There was the only thing that was from Gloucester was the bodies. Everything else was fitted out by the council. Note the position of the controller and also where the handbrake is. It was a heck of a reach, and the driver also was not in the best place to see where he was going. But that was the start of the Glasgow standard car, which became this by 1935. They went through 4 phases of upgrading to produce a fully enclosed car. Eventually, there would be 1,005 of them. But the funny thing was, they were called standards, but they were anything but standards. There was all sorts of variations on them. It experimented with various designs. This was one with a reverse staircase. The control has been moved to a more sensible position, and the top deck has been extended with the canopy over the driver, etc. This was the only one they ever built like this. And this is one fully lined out as an early standard known as phase 1. Look at the Greek corners on the paneling. That was perpetuated right up to the Second World War. Where it says Partick and Kilmarnock, that was the colour, the route colour, that would have been red. That route was red, dark red, Partick and Kilmarnock. And even on the dash, the round dash at the end of the car, it's lined out. They were very keen on lining. The Tudor arch windows were to become a feature of Glasgow standards right through to the end of them. They were so desperate for new cars at the start of the 20th century that they took 120 of the best of the horse cars which they'd had, and converted them into electric cars by extending them as shown. This is a drawing by the late Ian Stewart, who is well known for his transport drawings, mainly trams. And it shows you the initial horse car and what it was extended to. They were a stopgap, and they discovered that they had been built of ash, which didn't last very well. And because of that, Glasgow built everything using teak throughout their history of building vehicles. They had the peculiar number system in Glasgow that the first electric cars were numbered from 665. The highest horse car had been 664. They continued building cars up to 1000, and then they went back to 665 and went backwards to number 1 until they had finished the series 1 to 1000. It took them until 1923 to do that. That's a converted horse car. They lasted in service up till World War I. 4 were sold off to the adjacent Dumbarton system. 1 went to Luton in England. There was a brief flurry of using some as parcel cars, which didn't last long in 1919, and the rest were scrapped. They then tried an experimental top cover known as a unobtrusive top colour. I don't know why they chose the word unobtrusive, because it was pretty obvious it wasn't an open topper. It had a completely open staircase. There was actually a door at the top of that staircase. It's not a particularly good photograph of it, but it does give you an idea of what they look like compared with other cars. These were all built during the managership of a James Dalrymple, 1904 to 26, who was a man who did not believe in stopping the trams at the city boundary, which is one reason why they ended up in many places well beyond the city boundary. Side view of the unobtrusive top cover, they had 6-foot trucks, Brill 21E, 2 30 horsepower motors. You can see the door there actually at the top at the left. It had this very odd bit which stuck out. The driver was virtually completely open. Again, though, the controller has been moved to a funny position. It's a real boarding house reach to reach the handbrake. Obviously, people were not coming down the front stairs, but nonetheless, it was an awkward driving position. There was only 18 of them ever built. They were confined to one route. This Mark Sinclair Drive, a short branch on the south side. They were all painted the red route colour, and the slipboard giving the name, the main areas it went through, or main arteries, was always on the side. Experiments were made with balconies and balcony roofs. This was what was called a phase 2 car when they started putting top covers on them. This one's got reverse staircase. The indicator is in an unusual place. They were not usually in that position. And the balcony top cover is completely round and covers over the extension of the balcony. Just for a change, Glasgow had a long history of decorated trams. This is apparently before the First World War. What it was for is not recorded, but it's taken outside the car works. And behind them, that wooden structure going up became the wood store for all the wood that they used in construction of cars in the works. Another variation of the balcony was a roundish cover. This is what called a phase two car. The controller has gone to a more normal position. And here's another one with a stubby balcony roof extension. Whoops. And again, the controller is in a better position. It's not a particularly good map, but it shows you how far they went out the city. The jagged red line running around the map is the city boundary. And you can see at many points, they went clear of the boundary. They were in the northwest of the city. They operated the trams of the borough of Clydebank right through to 1962. To the west of the city, Paisley, Paisley Cross there, they took over the Paisley system, which we'll come to later. But it was a pretty extensive system at its height. Another version of the balcony, this became the standard, the stub roof, the squared off roof, the destination box halfway between the decks. And by this time, they had 7-foot trucks. That was what it would look like in its heyday when it would be red. This was just what this car had just been restored in about 1960, 61 in Copley Hill Car Works, going into the Transport Museum. It's fitted with a bow collector, but of course it went into the Transport Museum with a trolley pole. Glasgow changed over from trolley pole to bow collector around about 1930. This is what would be called a phase 3 standard. By this time, they've got 7-foot trucks. The driver has been completely vestibuled, and also note there's what was called a roll top cover over the staircase. The front, the rear, that cover is on, but when the tram was being driven, the cover would be on at the other end. That would be open, obviously, to let people up the stairs into the top deck. The idea was to stop drafts on the driver, because when they vestibuled the cars, they got this terrific driver. They got to that standard just before the First World War. In 1922, they purchased the Adrian Courtbridge Tramway Trust. This had been set up in 1920 by the adjacent towns of Adrian Courtbridge, which bought out the local tramway company, which ran a line of 3.36 miles, 5.84 kilometers, much of it, as you can see, single track. They only had 17 cars, 14 open toppers on brush 6-foot trucks, and 3 top covered cars, which had been on Lycett and Connaughty 7'6" trucks, which was slightly larger than Glasgow was using. The system was not in a good state when they bought it. They connected it by a 2-mile reserve track tramway with the nearest Glasgow City tram terminus at Baillieston. And then when they'd done that, they closed the line completely and rebuilt it into a double track line, which lasted actually till 1956. All the trams from this system were transferred to the far west of the system at Elders Lee Depot and Paisley, and Glasgow filled the depot with normal standard cars in Coatbridge. One of the 3 top covered cars, which ended its days running around in Paisley on local routes. Glasgow did not consider them anywhere near the standard of their own standard cars. This is part of the 2-mile reserve track tramway they built connecting the Glasgow city system with the Adrian Courtbridge system. It's going through a village called Bargeddy. This was very much a mining area at the time. When this closed in 1956, the track bed was incorporated into the road, and it's now a dual carriageway, and nothing of this remains, fields or buildings. It's all built up, and there's a huge motorway junction just roughly at the end of the tram track. It's a bit like the Spaghetti Junction in Birmingham. In 1922, the Tramways Department took over the Glasgow and District Subway Company. This had been built in 1896 and was the third underground railway in the world, London being 1890, and Budapest was the same year as Glasgow, opened 3 weeks ahead of Glasgow. Budapest had the sense to use electricity and standard gauge. The subway company did not. For some reason, having been authorised to build it to standard gauge, they got another act and built it to 4-foot gauge. It was twin tunnels, 15 stations, 2-car trains, cable hauled. Was never much of a success, which why the city council had to take it over, and it became part of the city transport system. It was electrified in 1933 to 35, which changed its fortunes completely. But with clearance of whole districts of the city following World War II, the traffic declined mightily, except between Hillhead and St Enoch's, because this area, Hillhead, Partick Cross, Kelvin Bridge, has become, since World War II, what you might call Studentville. It's the Glasgow University has expanded mightily, and the whole area has changed its character. Numerous experiments were made with the standard cars in relation to trucks. Trucks of various sizes were tried, some as wide as 10 feet. They also tried some Brill bogies. This is number 15, Brill 39E1 bogies. And you notice there had to be alterations to the platform, actually reduced part of the width of the platform. Not a great success. It had its bogies replaced by a standard Brill 21E 8-foot truck in 1939, and worked the rest of its life as a perfectly normal standard car. Then in 1923, August 1923, Glasgow purchased the Paisley and District Tramway Company, which had quite an extensive system extending from Renfrew Ferry, which was on the River Clyde, to the centre of Paisley and way west to Kilbarchan. There was a lot of double track, but the route beyond the centre of Johnson to Kilbarchan was single track with some very small loops, which were to cause a lot of problems a few years later. They also went through South Paisley into the nearby industrial town of Barhead. And they then built a long extension on reserve track to connect with the Glasgow system near a place called Brooking Glen, which was a country park much favoured by day trippers before World War II. And this is a section of that track. Most of it was alongside a country road. That bridge, funnily enough, is still there. They didn't demolish the bridge, but everything you can see, apart from the stonework, has disappeared. It's been fully built up. There's a 4-lane dual carriageway, and there's a huge industrial and shopping complex to the right of the curve in the distance, and everything else is built up, totally unrecognizable. And as late as 1952 or 3, it was a purely country area. In August 1923, Glasgow built the first reserve track, slightly ahead of the reserve track you saw earlier. This was along Moss Park Boulevard, which was a corporation housing scheme of the 1920s. You can just see the houses through the trees. And it's alongside what was called Bellahouston Park, and there'll be much more of that later. It's in the latter, this was taken about 1959-60, and the Coronation tram then would have been about 20 years old. The Paisley Company had some Hurst-Nelson built open toppers, which were similar to the London County Council M-class trams, and they were very well built. Glasgow spent a lot of money on. They converted them completely to phase 4 standards, a completely enclosed standard. But they had a lower, the bumper at the front on the dash was lower than the normal Glasgow standard car. And quite a few tram drivers discovered over the years, if they tried to help a broken down car, if they were driving a Paisley car, they would get a damage done on the dash because the bumpers didn't coincide. The original cars of the Paisley Company were, where am I? I've got slightly lost, folks. The original cars of the Paisley Company were built by British Electric Company, BEC, and they were not well built. And Glasgow in 1923-24 constructed a route on in Clydebank on behalf of the Borough Council up a steep hill to a place called Antoka. The route was bedeviled by a low railway bridge followed by a canal bridge, and it could only be operated by single deckers. So they took 17 of the Paisley original cars and cut them down, vestibuled them like this. The first trams fitted with air brakes. Then in 1930 odd, they were fitted with these great long bow collectors, which got them under the low bridge without problems. That was what the Hurst-Nelson open toppers ended up as, completely enclosed standards. The top cover obviously didn't match the saloon with its 3 big windows and the normal 5 windows of a Glasgow standard up above. That is 1068. Glasgow renumbered the Paisley cars by simply adding 1,000 to the numbers. And it survived, it was preserved, and it ended up at Cryche, and where it was restored initially as Paisley 68 as an open topper. The original cars, about 50 of them, were all built to this specification. They were poorly built, the BEC cars. Glasgow did not let them anywhere near the city. They spent their days between Renfrew, Paisley, and Johnson, Kilbarchan. And Glasgow did not spend much money on them, and they were all gone by 1932. They were never fitted with bow collectors. Whoops, going the wrong way, sorry. Right, Glasgow then took 11 of the Hurst-Nelson cars, which they were rebuilding as fully enclosed cars. The lower saloon of a Paisley car was 7 inches lower than the saloon of a Glasgow standard. And they then took 6 inches, off the top deck. And you'll notice that the colour route band is a lot narrower than the one on that car. And also the indicator box is up to the windows where there's a gap. The interest in this car to me, this photograph to me, is that I discovered that was myself sitting there with my mother and my aunt. This is the summer of 1949. It was taken at Renfrew Ferry. The River Clyde is just there. There was a chain ferry across the river to a place called Yoker, where the main tram route from Glasgow to Clydebank passed by. It was a very, very busy place and a lot of traffic in those days. This was what a low height car looked like. You can see that the colour band looks pretty narrow. Unfortunately, Copler Hill never thought to check the loops on the single track section beyond Johnston. And when they were fitted with 8-feet trucks, they couldn't cope with the loops on the single track section. They had been designed 11 of them to get under a low railway bridge at Elderslie, where normal height standards could not go. And rather than use them between Johnston and Paisley, which would have made sense, the whole Hurst-Nelson batch, including normal height cars, were then distributed all over the system for some reason. And the Johnson route soldiered on with old cars against ever-increasing bus competition. In 1926, excuse me a second, this car appeared. Bus competition had become intense on the long routes beyond the city to places like Paisley, Airdrie or Uddingston, well beyond the city boundaries. And a deputation of councillors had been across to America with the manager, Mr. Dalrymple, and they'd come back full of American ideas, having seen sort of interurban cars, and this was the result. Anything but. It was designed for passenger flow, which historically never worked in Glasgow. The doors were far too narrow. It was on 77 E1 Brill bogies, 33'6" long, 32 seats, that was all. And it was not a success. It was tried all over the system, and they came to the conclusion that 33 feet of road space could be better occupied by a 59-seater standard car. So it became a one-off. It was sent to Elderslie and shuttled between Paisley and Johnson till the Johnson route closed in 1932, then went to the route in Clydebank up to Duntowker. When that route closed, it was stored, and then the Scottish Tramway Museum Society suggested it could be used in the rush hours, and it spent the rest of its days going between the shipyards of Clydebank and Partick Depot, morning and evening. It was repainted for the final procession in 1962 and is now in the Glasgow Museum of Transport. And that is it in its rebuilt mode, with the front exits being done away with, but the other exits were not widened. It was a slow loader, and it was ideal suited to shipyard traffic because they all got on at one place and then just spilled out at stops along the line. In 1926, they opened a reserve track in the west end of the city along Great Western Road into a new housing scheme called Knightswood. And one of Mr. Dalrymple's pipe dreams was that this reserve track would go all the way to Loch Lomond and carry Glaswegian passengers all the way to the Bonnie Banks. It never came off. The boulevard was built as a dual carriageway, virtually all the way eventually to Loch Lomond, but it never saw a tram on it. This was the standard construction of centre pole with cross arms on reserve track, except on the bit they inherited from Paisley. In 1927, this odd car appeared. The tramways had decided to go in for bogie cars on the interurban routes, double-decker bogie cars, and they took a standard car, number 142, and that was the 5 windows there with the original car. They then took the ends of it off and put a half window on either side of the lower deck and the upper deck, making 6 windows and still retaining the rocker panels, etc. Fitted what was then the standard vestibules, but the top deck end was varied. Why? It was a good question, because they made it more complicated, more windows actually. That was a prototype for 50 bogie cars to be built. That was built, altered I should say, at Copel Hill Car Works. And that is what it looked like when it was first in service on the green route from Paisley to either Airdrie or Uddingston. Very much an odd looking car. It survived actually until about 1949. They also built this, the other prototype, a straight-sided bogie car, 4 windows, saloon, lower and upper, and the same front end and standard dashes. The dashes originally had been round, but in the latter stage of building phase 3s, 312 cars were built with these hexagonal dashes, and all the bogie cars were built with hexagonal dashes. They're the same motors as the standards, 260 horse motors, and the bogies were Hurst Nelson on a 4'2" wheelbase of the same type as the London County Council, which Hurst Nelson had supplied many for. The vehicles were said to have been influenced by the LCC E-1 cars, but they didn't look anywhere as good, actually. They were a strange vehicle, but they rode very well, they were comfortable, and most of them lasted to 1959-60. That was what they looked like when they were on the red route. They were originally employed between Paisley and, as I say, Airdrie or Uddingston, but they came to grief on the sharp right-hand corner in Argyle Street. They climbed out of that regularly and could cause an awful lot of chaos at times. So they were hurriedly withdrawn, repainted red, and put on the route from Clydebank right through the centre of the city and out into the East End, where they spent the rest of the days, because it was a straight route with virtually no bend. By this time, the last standard car had been converted into phase 4, and Glasgow had 1,005 cars looking like this, but 388 of them were known as semi-high speed standards, because instead of 8-foot trucks, they had 7'6" trucks, and instead of 60 horse motors, they had 45 horse motors. But to the average traveling public, they all looked the same. They experimented with a pantograph in 1933, but nothing came of it. By 1933, the Glasgow standard was looking decidedly old-fashioned. They still had the curved rocker panel, Tudor arch windows, the indicator box sitting on the canopy bend, all this full lining, when by comparison, Sheffield, with their standard cars, there was a smooth outline, the indicators were recessed, straight-sided, etc. But Glasgow persisted with that standard design right to the end. A converted horse car, which had survived till 1933, was finally withdrawn. In the Paisley area in 1932, the route to Johnston and Kilbarchan had been closed because of tense bus competition. Trolley buses were considered for it, but because it was outside the boundary, there wouldn't have been any protection under the 1930 Road Traffic Act. So in 1932, they gave up, and the trams terminated in Paisley, just past the centre. The track had to be maintained to Elderslie Depot for depot access, and in later years, the trams were extended more or less back to it. But in 1933, this route to Abbotssinch was closed, a small industrial area. It was a complete dead duck of a route. And now where that tram is and where the people are standing is Glasgow Airport, and totally unrecognisable. In 1934, the last major extension to Glasgow trams was built. The tracks had been laid in 1924 over this bridge, a railway bridge at Hill Foot in the northwest beyond the city boundary. The trams have been running to Hill Foot since before the First World War, but the London and North Eastern Railway objected to the weight of the trams on the bridge. And basically they wanted the corporation to help pay for rebuilding the bridge. The corporation wouldn't. And there was a standoff for 10 years. And a works car had to be sent up the tracks periodically, the 1.7 miles to Milngavie, to go through the points, etc., and keep the claim to the tracks. Anyway, it was all sorted by 1934, when you can see there's all the sort of councillors, probably, they've all been brought up there in 2 corporation buses. It's a sepia photograph, it's not a black and white, obviously. And that's the first car over the bridge. What was very ironic, the route to Milngavie was a blue-coloured route, and they picked a yellow-coloured car. In 1935, 11 EMB flexible axle trucks were bought and tried under various standards. They were said to be very successful. The rolling stock engineer was very pleased with them, the results they got from them, but unfortunately, no more were built. There was a long tradition in Glasgow of decorated cars, which went on right up to 1959. This was 1934, an ideal homes exhibition in the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow. And this was the Transport Department's effort on 2 permanent way cars. No way means of identifying the cars, but they may well have been cut down standards. By 1938, the numbering system was introduced. They still kept the route colours. This is a white coloured car, as is that. And until the white patch here is where roller blind boxes were going to go, but until they were fitted, they were issued with route cards which had to be displayed. And you notice there's various ideas of where to display them. The conductor of the second car is ready to lean out and pull the bow collector over, which of course they had to do at all termini, but it was a lot easier than swinging a trolley pole. And the crews are obviously enjoying a photograph being taken. This was taken in 1938, just after the numbers were introduced and before the roller blinds were fitted. It's at the university terminus. Unfortunately, the trams didn't get quite past the university. The university managed to prevent them going past on the grounds that would cause interference with special equipment. The rather large looking building on the left was the Students' Union. 1936 appeared this, a complete change from what had gone before. There was a 1938 Empire exhibition scheduled, and the Transport Department was going to pull all its stops out to build a car worthy of this exhibition. And this was one of 2 prototypes. 34-foot body, 20-foot saloon on EMB lightweight bogies, 4.9 wheelbase, Metrovic 4x35 horse motors. They were very well appointed inside, as you'll see shortly, and they had these translucent eaves on the upper deck, fitted with a complete set of indicators. The huge number books, they started using head codes, which had been tried out in 1925 and failed. The crews didn't like them. They had to be changed at the end of every route. There was a different number for each direction. It was overly complicated, but the new cars came with these head codes. Separate driver's cab, etc. That was the first prototype. The second prototype was this. It had Maley and Taunton swing-link bogies of only 4'2" wheelbase, but it had a 5-window body, upper and lower. Other than that, it was exactly the same. They were fitted with electro-pneumatic control gear, and the cabinet was in the lower deck up against the staircase. This was painted in red, white and blue. It came out in March 1937, 2 months before the coronation of George VI, and it got the nickname of the Coronation Car, which stuck and became the official description by the Transport Department, coronations, as they started building them in that year. Also, to many members of the Glaswegian public, they were known as exhibition cars. My mother's family called them that. I only knew them as exhibition cars until I discovered modern tramway when I was 16. I don't know what that's doing there. This is 1142. You can see the totally different bogies. Also, they both had this corporation transport, which lit up at night, these glass eaves above the windows. And it's showing a head code number, and in typical fashion, it's showing what would have been the wrong number. Those numbers would disappear in 1938. That was the lower deck of a coronation, and what they called alhambrinal fitted ceilings, very comfortable cars. The EP cabinet is there. It made peculiar notching up noises when the car moved off, and it's a noise always associated with the coronation cars. You can still hear, or you could hear it at Crouch until recently. The lighting was all behind these diffusers, and these were actually padded, so when you were sitting there, your arm was against a cushioned pad. That's the lower deck, that's the upper deck. You can see the translucent eaves, and there was ventilation ducts in the ceiling. At the end here, behind that window, there was a single seat set at right angles, and that was any tram enthusiast's favourite seat when the tram was going forward. They had a capacity of 64 seats, which was only actually 5 more than a standard tram. In 1938, when the Empire Exhibition started, it was held in what was called Bellehouston Park, and you can see there was a tram route ran right round the park that way and that way. And during the exhibition, which ran from May till October, they maintained a 2-minute tram frequency on a circular route. This is also the state of the tram routes in 1938, when they had just been numbered. The numbers were 1 to 20, and there was quite a few A's and B's around. But that was to all change in 1943. This was the livery of the coronations. They came out in what was called a sort of traction orange lower deck. And this was bus green. It was a different green to what had been used in the standards, which was much darker. And from 1939, all standards, as they went through for repainting, were repainted into what was called bus green. It took a long time. The last colour didn't disappear till 1953. This is a view taken after 1951, because before 1951, trams did not carry external adverts. And the only adverts they carried internally were usually notices by the Transport Department. In 1939, the single-decker route up from Clydebank to Duntowker, the ex-Paisley cars were beginning to get a bit worn out. And Copley Hill Car Works took 5 standard cars, semi-high-speed cars with 45 horse motors, cut them down to single-decker and scrapped 5 of the ex-Paisley cars. The idea was to scrap all the ex-Paisley cars, but the war intervened and stopped it. And the ex-Paisley cars actually carried on till 1949. October 1939, the first of 4 what were called experimental lightweight cars appeared. It was like a 4-wheel single truck version of the coronation. The Copley Hill Car Works were concerned about the construction and maintenance costs of the coronations, which the public thought wonderful, but for only 5 seats, it cost 50% more in electricity to move a coronation than a standard. At this time, there was a very strong pro-trolleybus lobby urging the tram fleet to be slimmed down. but the general manager of the time was very much against it, managed to prove that it would be cheaper to build cars like this than run trolleybuses. Unfortunately, again, the war intervened. There was only these 4 ever built. They had varying trucks, very electrical equipment to try ideas out. The doors were manual, they were not motor operated. And they changed the coronation layout round, they put the number on the right. They also had this dash number, which would only be seen when you were getting on the car. They should have really been on the other side, but they were lower than the standards. They were very nippy cars, but for some reason they were all banished to Elderslie Depot in 1953 and used on rush hour routes in the Paisley area, because the sort of fate of odd cars in a big system. They weren't liked by the drivers, sorry. In 1941, standard car number 6 was totally destroyed by enemy action, and Copley Hill Works built another experimental lightweight body. They gave it the number 6 because you weren't really supposed to build brand new cars in the middle of the Second World War. And the myth grew up that it was a rebuild of standard 6, but the late Ian Stewart saw the Copley Hill car records, and all that was carried back to Copley Hill was a lorry load of scrap. There was nothing left of the car. It received a direct hit, actually. And so that should have been 1005, but it was numbered 6 for the reasons given. This is 1004, one of the lightweights. It's at the back of Elderslie Depot, and it's standing on a line which was formerly the rail connection to the railway running here. There's a railway running over there. And in the background is the saloon of an old standard, which was used when they started scrapping cars for pulling the bodies over to be burnt. This had obviously sustained serious damage, and Elderslie Depot had maintained its workshop from Paisley Company days. In fact, after World War II, it took along a lot of extra work when Copley Hill was finding it difficult to cope with maintenance on the aging fleet of standards. It was repaired quietly at Elderslie Depot and put back into service. And apparently there was no record in the Copley Hill repairs book of 1005 sustaining damage. Elderslie tended to sort of act as if they were almost an independent company. They used route cars until the 1950s. Then in 1940 appeared this, the experimental bogie car. They took a Kilmarnock bogie, one of the bogie, 50 bogie cars, and they took the ends away and put on what you might call a version of the coronation, except it tapered much more to the extent they couldn't get normal indicators in. So they used what was the style of the buses at the time: number, destination, via. This is a wartime photograph, as the white bumper indicates. It had colour light indicators, and it's believed Glasgow was considering using the same system as was used in Edinburgh, but nothing came of it. It was fitted with Maillon Taunton field control, which they had a tremendous load of bother with. The engineers were up in Glasgow for considerable time trying to put it right. But there was a comical side to it because it operated at line voltage. And in rush hours going along Argyle Street, for instance, when it was used on the main east-west route, if there were a lot of cars behind this one, the line voltage dropped. And this car stopped, so everybody else stopped, and then the line voltage went back up, and it would move off again until it stopped again. So you would get a convoy kangarooing its way through the city centre. They eventually cured that. and it eventually had British Thomas Houston equipment fitted. It was said to be probably the only contactor-equipped maximum traction tram in the UK. It survived into preservation and went to Christchurch, where it was nicknamed the Horonation rather than the Coronation. This was it in latter days on a tour at the Auchenshoggle terminus. It showed you the state the cars got into in the last years. In the last 5 or so years of the tram system, standards did start to drop. Maintenance wasn't so good, tracks weren't so good, and cars tended to look scruffy. This was it the day after the closure of the system on the 2nd of September 1962. Now in 1947, 22nd December, the experimental one-way car appeared. The manager at the time, Eric Fitzpaine, manager from 1943, he was very keen on passenger flow. It was fitted for passenger flow. The seats were fixed like bus type seats. The passenger flow scheme didn't work. Glaswegians seemed to resist it somehow. But it appeared in this livery, and this was a dark blue, mid blue, and then this was a sort of eggshell, very pale blue. It was quite a revelation. I was told when I arrived as an 11-year-old in 1948 on holiday by my aunt that there was a new car on the 33. So the next day I stood and waited till this apparition appeared, and I was fascinated with it. It ran very smoothly, and it could only be confined to one route, basically, until they designed a special schedule for it, where you could reverse on a depot triangle. The livery was put into normal coronation livery in October 1949. It had Crompton Parkinson equipment and 4 45 horse motors. It had what was called the Vanback system, variable automatic multi-notch braking and acceleration control, 72 seats, the highest ever in Glasgow, and Maley and Taunton 6-foot wheelbase bogies. It was when I had arrived, it was full of school kids because it was the summer holidays. This was it, just having been constructed, been photographed outside. That's the car works behind it. These look like ladies from the canteen or from the offices, just for the fun of the photograph. That was the offside, no doors, of course. And that was the back. There's a lot of photographs of it showing Route 34, never operated on Route 34. And that was it on Moss Park Boulevard. And it looks like a gentleman with a hat there, looks like it could be some sort of official trip. This was it in later years in coronation livery, reversing itself on the depot triangle at Mary Hill in the northwest. It had a lot of trouble. It spent more time in Copley Hill Car Works than actually spent on the road, until it was eventually fitted with, now where are we? I've lost myself slightly. Yeah, it was fitted with British Thomas Houston equipment. They got rid of the Crompton Parkinson equipment. It was rebuilt in 1956 as a normal double end and looked very much like the Cunadas, but the back end looked slightly squashed, and it was withdrawn in May 1962 and scrapped. In 1948, there was a very short extension built on the south side of the city, about a half mile, into a pre-war. These type of houses had been built in about early 1930s, but it was 1948 before they got a tram service, and that was a coronation at the far end of the track. It's just come across the crossover. In December 1948, the first what was officially called the Mark II coronation, or Cunarder, came into service. They were not built as to the high specification of the coronations, but they were still very smart cars nonetheless. 100 of them were built between December 1948 and February 1952. You'll notice the number box is quite different to the coronation's huge number boxes. They had 4x45 horse motors, Metrovic remote control, and the bogies were Merley and Taunton's HS 44 Type 596. They seated 70, so they seated 6 more than the coronations. This is a view of the first tram in 1985 in Blackpool, and the sole surviving Edinburgh tram 35 in front on the prom at Blackpool. You can see here one of the faults of the Cunarder. This bit was curved and the indicators were slightly recessed, so they got very dirty very quickly. And in later years, the indicators, it was often difficult to see the indicators. In 1949, April 1949, the last lengthy section of single track on the system between Barhead and the Glasgow boundary at Spears Bridge was closed. There was a long section of single track with these loops, which were not thought to take bogie cars. And it was signaled, the car is about to go over a signal bar contact on the wire. It was not replaced by corporation regular service buses. There was intense bus competition along this road anyway. Up to 1951, you could still see red and blue route-coloured cars. This was taken, this siding was the terminus at Mary Hill. The tracks continued to Mulgai. And you can see 3 cars. They've been repainted in the bus green livery, same as the coronations. Not a particularly good colour photograph, but it does give you an idea. And this one's got the indicator change before they get into service, into the siding. It was a tight siding, which was replaced in later years by a crossover for just 100 yards along this road. The reason for that, I'll tell you in a minute. This was the state of the standards by the 1950s. They were still quite in reasonable condition in the early 50s. Blinds were sometimes getting a bit dirty, but the car looks basically sound, but it's an old-fashioned looking car by the 1950s. There was no doubt about it. Following the Second War, they designed these stops for the city centre, where you had a few tram routes and you could segregate the tram routes by stops. They were red, the same colour as the red route colour had been. They had similar stops for the buses, which were yellow but with the letter B. This was a view of Copley Hill Car Works in the 50s. It must be the 50s because there's a couple of coronations there. It's hard to see what's going on. It could be scrapping with all these trucks sitting there, and there's Cunarder bogies sitting there as well. In the 1951, there was produced what was called the Ingalls Report, which recommended the electrification of the Glasgow suburban railways. But it also recommended that the Glasgow trams be cut back to the boundary, which the corporation did not want at the time. That was because of pressure from the group of Scottish bus companies who saw the lengthy routes that Glasgow ran as very lucrative. This was the type of electric train that was used initially when the system started in 1960. Although the long-term future of the trams was in doubt by the early 1950s, they had started a small trolleybus system in 1949. It grew eventually to 8 routes with 196 vehicles, but outlasted the trams by less than 5 years. They had still not taken the decision to totally abandon the trams, and Glasgow went looking for second-hand trams, and they repainted Glasgow colours. They kept this very large indicator box and fitted them with much bigger numbers than the Coronation cars. They were not a success. They had to spend a lot of money on them. The first one went into service in 1953, the last in 1956. The first one was withdrawn in January 1957. They were off the road by 1960. They had tremendous trouble with ingress of water in this area. They had not been terribly well constructed at Liverpool in the first place. They were not as well constructed as the Coronations. They had not been looked after during or after the Second War. And when Glasgow realised they were spending a lot of money on them, and also there were frequent visitors to the car works. One was preserved and restored as Liverpool 869 and runs at Crouch. Some had EMB bogies. This one had Mailey and Taunton Swing Link. This was at the Milngavie terminus, the most northerly terminus on the Glasgow system. This was another one going up Hope Street, the city centre, with EMB lightweight bogies. And this one has EMB heavyweight bogies, same as supplied to Johannesburg. The second batch of trams I got from Liverpool had to be shunted into Newlands Depot for storage because Copley Hill Works was under pressure and just couldn't cope with them at the time. But they were all dealt with at Copley Hill within a year. You can see to the right some examples of the prefab houses that were built in the UK after World War II. In 1956, most routes going beyond the boundary had been cut back to the boundary, and the beneficiaries were the bus companies of the Scottish Bus Group. And you got some ridiculous termini being sort of not a proper traffic point, but it was simply the boundary, and that was it. However, in 1954, the first of 6 new body Coronations appeared. The bogies were second-hand from Liverpool. Liverpool had a fire at the Green Lane Depot in 1947 and lost a large number of trams. And Glasgow purchased 6 sets of bogies from them and didn't do anything with them for 7 years, but then constructed what were known as Mark I replacement Coronations. It looked to all the world like a Coronation externally. They were just quite plain fitted inside. They didn't have alhambrinal ceilings or anything like that. But to all intents and purposes, as far as the public were concerned, they were a Coronation car. Regrettably, they were only to have 8 years in service, and some would have less for a reason we'll come to in a minute. Glasgow had also been offered Liverpool's 100 four-wheel baby grands, the four-wheel version of the Green Goddess, on 9-foot trucks, but they weren't in a good state, and by this time the corporation wasn't prepared to spend much money. A further 39 green goddesses were offered, but they were in quite a poor condition, so no further action was taken. This is one of, no, that's a coronation at the Maryhill terminus, which replaced the siding you saw earlier. This is where the road widened out and they laid a crossover on the tracks to Mulgai. And that was the highest number tram ever in Glasgow, 1398. One of the replacement mark coronations shown on a tour. By the late 50s, this was the state the standards had got into. Funny enough, it's obviously been fitted with a new indicator, but the body is still reasonably straight, but it looks as if it hasn't had a good wash for quite a while. The tram system ran down quite quickly between 1956 to 1962. Various routes were withdrawn without bus replacement because the traffic following World War II, a series of slum clearances had cleared whole districts and huge estates had been built out in the suburbs with new bus routes. And in many of the main tram arteries, there were more buses than trams. And it had an obvious effect on tramway revenue. So some routes were simply taken off, and that was it. 1958 was the year in which 9 routes were withdrawn, the real big year. And then there were 3 left in 1962. 1961, March 22nd, there was a depot fire at Dalmarnock in the southeast of the city, which destroyed 50 cars completely, 5 standards, 15 coronations, 26 Cunardas, and 4 replacement Mark I coronations. The latter only been built in 1954. By a miracle of organisation, all of the depot's duties were covered the following day using cars from other depots and spare crews from Dalmarnock. Cars that had been stored prior to scrapping from recent tram conversions were hurriedly dusted down and pressed into service, along with some standards put aside for preservation. No buses were used, funnily enough, to cover any duties. They then used 5 of the lies in the section that had been burnt out. First, they wired it up and they used it for depot purposes. Glasgow had 2 canal bridges on its system, one on the busy route to Dalmuir West and one in Clydebank up the hill on the route to Duntowker. In 1960, the canal bridge was unexpectedly closed for repairs, and the trams could not reach Dalmuir West and reversed just behind where the photographer was standing. Note the catch point: when the bridge was open, that point would, if any tram was daft enough to keep coming, it would have been diverted into the curb. That was what the bridge looked like when it was half open. You can see the section with the wires moving independently. But to people's surprise, on the 1st of August 1960, the bridge was reopened to trams just for the last 2 years. And 1089, the single decker, it's actually being used on a tour. It was known, funnily enough, as Wee Baldy because of the cream bit at the front. It got that nickname among the crews. The 4-foot 7 3/4 gauge enabled standard gauge wagons to run on the flanges. And in Govan, on the south bank of the Clyde, the huge Fairfield shipping yard had this electric locomotive built by the Dick Kerr Works, Preston. And it is about to swing into Govan Goods Yard. You can see the curve there, where 2 tracks of the railway goods yard were wired, and it would pick up wagons. to haul about 3/4 of a mile to the shipyard. That's it coming out the shipyard in the late 50s. Trolleybus wires are up. This must be 1958 when the trolleybuses started. The trams were still running. They had originally been fitted with a trolley pole, but in 1930, the loco was fitted with a bow collector. This is about to turn into the yard with a train of wagons behind it. This was a common sight in Govan for about 50 years. After the trams had gone from Govan, they left the tram tracks in the section between the goods yard and the shipyard for the Fairfield Shipyard Company. But they, instead of just leaving the tram wires up, they've put an extra pair of trolleybus wires up the middle of the road and fitted the loco with twin trolley poles. This operation, this obviously with the enthusiast, this ran till 1966, and the locomotive is now preserved at the Scottish Railway Preservation Society, Bowness on the Firth of Forth. The city made much use of permanent way cars and had a huge permanent way yard opposite Copley Hill Car Works. A lot of the permanent way cars were cut down standards, as is that one, and as is that one. This view was taken the day after the system closed, and it shows you all the bits of track that had been lifted and were piled up. The yard was very extensive and was a very busy yard until the last few years. I put this one in because it shows the typical tenement areas that the trams ran through. 3 stories, ground and 1, 2, 3. And they're densely packed and obviously very lucrative for trams in its heyday. This is a Kilmarnock bogie on tour, and the reason I've shown this is this model horse tram sticking out from the wall. It's a pub, and it was called Ye Old Tramcar Vaults. And it had been there for many years. I remember being fascinated with it as a child. When all the buildings you can see here, everything was demolished and rebuilt with lower density housing. And the tram, model tram, disappeared, but it turned up and is now in the safekeeping of the Glasgow museums. And this is in for the reason of showing you the sort of heavy industrial areas that the trams ran through, which in their turn were great traffic generators at the rush hour. The green line demonstrates all that was left in the closure in 1962, the Route 9 from Dalmuir West right through to Auchenshuggle, and the connecting track to Copley Hill Car Works on the south side. And this huge system had come down to this one route. This was the last day, 1st of September 1962. You can just see a slack wire there. Glasgow had this idea at crossovers where the running wire was raised slightly, and there was this slack wire which made it slightly easier for the crews to reverse the bow collector. Dundee and Aberdeen, who had bow collectors, had a gadget, a hook on the wire that when the tram went backwards, it caught the bow, flipped it over, and the conductor didn't have to do anything. But Glasgow never adopted it. Between the 2nd of September and the 4th of September 1962, they ran a part-day service from Anderson Cross, just west of the city centre, to Auchenshuggle at a special fare. 6pence, outrageous in those days. To give people a chance to have a last tram ride. And on the Tuesday, the 4th of September, there was to be a closing procession at 6:15, And the last tram on this special service arrived at the depot at 6:05. It's just about to go in, and all the special cars are lined up in the depot with all the councillors, the bailies, the high Hegians, and all the rest of it. And a few enthusiasts. I was in one of the Canadas, and you had to write in for the tickets, etc. The procession started at 6:15, and the weather started going downhill. Unfortunately, it had been a reasonable day. It was led by the preserved horse car 543, which you saw way back at the beginning, 6 other preserved electric trams destined for the Transport Museum, and a line of 6 coronations and 6 Canadas. This is when they were held up. A car had a slight damage to its lifeguard tray, and they managed to fix it. You can see all the umbrellas up, people with coats and hats. There's not very many good photographs through of the procession through the city centre to Copley Hill, because the heavens just opened, which is unfortunate. However, that was not the last tram journey. Clydebank Borough Council, whose tramways Glasgow had operated since the inception, asked if they could have a special ride for the town council. So 1282, the car it is now preserved at Crouch, drove from Dalmarnock Depot with the general manager and his son on board, and other inspector and so forth. And it went to Clydebank Town Hall. This is the building here where the town council came out, got in the tram. They went to the extremity at Dalmuir West. Then they went back past the town hall to the Glasgow boundary, back to the town hall. Then they all got out and went in for a celebration banquet. The 12-year-old son of the general manager, of course, was not allowed to go in. He was sent back with the tram. But when the tram got back to, it's about to reverse into Dalmarnock Depot, you will notice there's a wee boy at the controls. The story goes that when the tram left Clydebank Town Hall and got a few hundred yards up the road, the inspector driving stopped the car and turned round and said to the 12-year-old boy, "Come on, son, come and have a go." And he drove the tram much of the way back to Dalmarnock. A member of Scottish Tramway Museum Society was waiting for a bus home at what was called Bridgeton Cross, just a few stops short of the depot. And he couldn't believe his ears when he heard a tram, and the tram appeared, and he put his arm out and it pulled up, and he got a lift to Dalmarnock Depot before he got his bus home. But he confirmed it was a boy driving it. His father never knew, apparently. The 4th of January, 1963, there was the last switching movement in Albert Drive outside the car works. 1297, Cunarda, which is now preserved at Crouch, is shunting Coronation 1274, which before its journey to Seashore Trolley Museum, USA, where I understand it still is. And then in February 1963, the following month, the power was finally switched off. And that was the last of any electric operation of trams in Glasgow. In 1912, Paisley 68, which had been preserved at Crouch for many years, was repainted into Glasgow livery as 1068 and as a blue route colour car, which it had been. And it was ceremoniously driven out of a depot in Crouch to the accompaniment of pipes, Scottish pipes. And there was the opportunity for a lineup of all the Glasgow cars preserved at Crouch. There's 1068s, there's 22 as a white car. It's restored as a phase 3 car with a balcony. 812 restored as a phase 4 fully enclosed car. and a Kilmarnock bogie 1115. Unfortunately, that does not run. It's normally in the exhibition hall. And 1282 Coronation, which is out of action at the moment, and it's in the queue for the workshops for total restoration. The Scottish Tramway and Transport Society has been running an appeal fund since 2013 with a target of 50,000, and with one final push this summer, we hope to reach that target of 50,000, which is not bad for a small society. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my presentation.